Graphing straight lines. Now this is part 2, and we're looking at straight lines that have a negative slope. That is, they slope down across the graph the way we would read. From left to right, they slope down instead of sloping up. And we'll also look at horizontal and vertical lines. Now, one thing that we should mention is that straight line graphs show a relationship between two variables, two things that can change. And on our graph, they're x and y. But in real life, they might be things like how many days I've been hiking and how much water I have left. If I have 10 litres of water for my hike and I use 2 litres every day, you can see that using 2 litres of water every day would mean that the amount of water I had would go down over time. This would make a graph that slopes down from a starting point of 10 litres down, and you can see that if I use 2 litres every day, I'd have 5 days. Now, we don't need to worry too much about the word problems, but I wanted to show the sort of thing that might give us a graph that slopes downwards. And this graph, I would start with 10 litres of water, and I would lose 2 litres for every day that I hiked. And if the number of days I had hiked was x, then that would mean I had minus 2x. And I'd be allowed to rearrange this if I wanted. Y equals negative 2x, and the 10 is positive, so that's plus 10. And that looks very much like the lines that we've been graphing lately, except that the coefficient of x, that 2 there, sorry, I was trying to draw an arrow, underline, coefficient of x, that means the number that x is multiplied by, it's negative. Graphs that slope downwards have a negative coefficient of x. So if your number in front of the x is negative, you know your graph will slope down. And so the steps are the same as for graphing any graph. Calculator for our table of values because we're dealing with negatives and it will help. Check. Oh, we'll plot our points first. Plot points. And we do 2 checks. Our checks are they in a straight line? But also, is it a downward straight line? Because negative coefficient, downward straight line. And then, of course, ruler, arrows, and label. Sorry, ran out of space there. So for example, graph this line. Y equals negative 2x plus 10. Hey, this is the graph of my water left from my hike. Use a calculator. Honestly, it will make life easier. Start with the 0 value of x. Remember, this is our what if table. Negative 2 times 0 plus 10 is 10. Keep going. Use the calculator when x is 1. Negative 2 times 1 plus 10. So I'm substituting x into the rule. 8. Negative 2 times 2 plus 10, 6. And you can see that just like the story we had at the start, if I'm using 2 litres of water every day, the amount of water, imagining that this is the amount of water I've got left, is going down by 2. So you can predict this one would be 4, And you can even predict this one over here where the negative is if you want, because following the pattern back, that would be 12. But of course, if we prefer, we could have got this answer with our calculator. -2 times -1 for x plus 10, 12. Calculator for table of values. Plot the points. -1, 12. It's not on the graph. That's okay. We don't need to plot all the points, just the ones that will fit on our number plane. 0, 10, 1, 8, 2, 6, 3, 4. Check. Straight line, and it's a downwards line because the coefficient of x was negative. Ruler. Rule your line through the dots, taking up as much of the graph as you can. Arrow at either end. Label with the rule. Another example, and the only reason I'm doing this example is because it's got a slightly funny thing here. Graph the line y equals -x minus 1. And we're confused here because we look at the coefficient of x and we don't see a number, we just see a negative. But remember the rule, when there's no number in front of our x, it means it's got a 1. So this is actually y equals -1x minus 1. And that just means -1 times x. So we do this with the calculator. Start at the 0. -1 times 0, take away 1, -1. Hey, you notice how where the x is 0, our y value is always going to be this number that's on the end. Where the x was 0, our y value is the number that's on its own. Then, keep going with our calculator. -1 times, x is 1 now. Take away 1, lots of 1s there, -2. Calculator, -1 times 2. Take away 1. -3. Hey, now we can see the pattern. That's going to be -4. Always check your -1s, especially with the calculator. But maybe we could follow back and predict what this is going to be. Predict it in your head. Look at the pattern going back. Now we'll check with the calculator. -1 times x is -1, so it's -1 times -1. Take away 1. 0. Did we predict 0? It fits in with the pattern. Fill in your table of values. We've done that. Plot our points. 0, -1. Oh, sorry. I started there. -1, 0, 0, -1, 1, -2, 2, -3, 3, -4. Do our checks. Yes, they're a straight line. Negative coefficient of x. Negative downward slope. Fill in the whole graph when you rule your line. Arrows at either end. Label it with the rule. Somewhere next to the line. Now, we do also need to be able to graph horizontal and vertical lines. If at this point you're feeling a bit swamped, you could stop and graph your straight line practice and come back and watch this later. But actually, horizontal and vertical lines are pretty easy. We've just got to remember one rule. This horizontal line, vertical line, that one's horizontal, has the rule x equals 3. Unlike our other rules, horizontal and vertical lines just have x equals a number or y equals a number, whereas other rules have x and y in the rule. If you look at this rule here, this line, every single point on this line is x equals 3. It doesn't matter what the y value is, x will always be 3. If you look at this line, every single point on this line has y is -1. It doesn't matter what x is, y is always -1. So the rule is that x equals a number, being my whole rule for the line, I will get a vertical line. And if y equals just a number with no x, I will get a horizontal line. And the thing that does confuse people a little bit is the x-axis is horizontal, but a y line is horizontal. It feels like it should be the other way around, but it's not. The x-axis is horizontal, but an x-line is vertical. Now our steps when they ask us to graph these: mark a point on the axis based on the rule. So for this one, when I have to graph y equals -4, I go to the y-axis and I mark a point at -4. And then my second step is rule a line through that point. That line has to cut through that axis and go the correct way. So to go through that point and cut through the axis, I'm going to rule a cross, arrows at either end, label it y equals -4, oops, not 14, -4, I'm sorry. And it works because our y equals a number gives me a horizontal line. Everywhere on that line, y equals -4. X equals 2. Mark a point on the x-axis at x equals 2 and put a line through that axis, cutting through, and label it x equals 2. Every single point on that line lines up with x equals 2. X equals a number gives me a vertical line. Now the only one that gets a bit tricky, x equals 0. I've got to put a point there, but then I have to remember x lines have to be vertical. So this line, x equals 0, is really hard to graph because it's on the y-axis and I've got to label that x equals 0. But that's how you graph horizontal and vertical lines.